Welcome back for Module 7. This week we are moving on from poetry and starting to look at creative nonfiction and memoir in particular. Basically, this is the art of telling your own story. Creative nonfiction is a fairly large genre. It encompasses a lot of different types of literature, including biography and autobiography. Do you know the difference between those two? An autobiography is a life story written by the person themselves. For instance, if I write my own life story, that would be considered an autobiography. If anyone else writes my biography, it's considered a biography, not an autobiography. So as I was saying, creative nonfiction also includes things like essays. This would be things that have a more creative bent and are not so much research-based, so more opinion, less fact. You have already read and listened to several pieces of short memoir or personal narratives. I completely adore David Sedaris and pretty much anything he writes, not just because he's funny, which he totally is, but also because of his way of slipping in a completely different message to his work when you least expect it. Oftentimes they're poignant or sad, but always 100% authentic and real. Plus, he has a very twisted sense of humor, which I deeply appreciate. By the way, that was just an excerpt from his complete essay on being a Christmas elf at Macy's. There is quite a bit more if you go seek out the whole piece called the Santaland Diaries, which I highly recommend. It comes from his compilation of essays called Holidays on Ice, which is this right here. We watched Susan Cain deliver a TED Talk about the power of being an introvert, this idea of coping with what some might see as a personality flaw. A personal aside, the first time I watched that, my mind was blown because I was exactly the kind of introverted person she was talking about. You also read about The Loss of Innocence and Faith by Langston Hughes. Some of you got Langston Hughes as the poet you were most like back when we took that survey in week 2. He was a Harlem Renaissance writer who lived from 1901 to 1967. And the piece you read was of his young 12-year-old self losing his faith by literally not being able to see Jesus like he was promised. I hope you picked up on how he engaged all the senses in that piece. And if you didn't, go back and take another look because it's quite clever and interesting. And finally, we read I Went to the Movies Just Once Hoping the Monster Got the Girl by Ron Curci. And we can feel the pain of what it is like to go through puberty and be on the outside. What all of these pieces have in common is that they are relatable. We can all relate to working a deeply stupid job, or being on the outside, being the other, waiting for an illuminating moment that we were promised that will come, but never does. So as you begin to look at this idea of crafting your own memoir, think of your own life stories that are compelling. Which of them are unusual or most engaging? For instance, if we are going to talk about stupid jobs, I once worked for a summer as an office temp for a huge corporation with multiple divisions and arms of commerce. I was stuck on the Michelin Tires account. This was back in 1993, before the internet existed. It was my job to sit in a dark little office with no windows and no computer and broken old office furniture and call long-haul truckers about their recent purchase of Michelin tires. It was my duty to confirm their purchase so that we could send them rebate coupons. What a great system. Of course, while this job was quite awful, my husband can beat just about anyone at the game of worst job ever. He once worked at a urine testing facility in receiving. That said, be thinking of some of your stories from your life, whether funny, fascinating, or moving, and what might be most interesting for others to hear about. So as we get started, here are a few suggestions for you when considering which story to tell. So think of something interesting or unusual from your life experiences or childhood. One thing I really encourage is not to take yourself too seriously when you first start writing. Life is serious enough, and you will engage readers more if you take a slightly humorous view or a lighter approach, even if you are talking about a serious matter. An effective way to tell your story can be using the proverbial between a rock and a hard place technique. Think about the Sedaris piece. He took the job as a Macy's Christmas elf because he was desperate for work. He needed money. The fact of this bumps hard against the humor he found in the ridiculousness of the situation. There are also a few things I would caution you against because they are difficult to write about in a new and interesting way. They have been done to death. The first is the big win or the big game. These always end up sounding the same, routine. I mean, how many new ways can you describe the big touchdown or the grand slam or winning the spelling bee even? That's a big win. They're pretty hard to make interesting and new. Number 2, please, 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 I'm begging you, avoid stories that are dreams. The "and then I woke up" trope is so old and tired. Please, just don't. For my sake. The main reason it ticks off so many people is that when you are tricking your audience with a wild tale only to find out it never happened, it's cheating, basically. And 3, avoid writing about events that amplify how hard you've had it. I'm not saying don't write about something difficult. You totally can do that. But just please be mindful that you don't make it out to be a poor me story. If you put out there that you've had it harder than almost everyone else, it's a direct challenge to your reader. We have all had extremely hard things that we've had to contend with in life. Making judgments on who has had it the worst makes the writer look like they are being morally superior, even if that was the last thing the writer intended. So for this exercise, start with the positives, start with the humor. As you gain experience, you can come back and tell your harder stories or stories that are more common. When we talk about how to tell your story, here are a few more tips to keep in mind. Let's see. The first one might sound counterintuitive, but start close to the end of your story. I've read some great pieces that really start way earlier than they need to. They took too long to get out of the gate. I don't need to hear about your alarm clock going off if you're telling me a story about something that happened that night. Find the closest place to start to the inciting incident that you can. Which brings me to the next point. Avoid mundane details. Even if you were brushing your teeth when the bird flew in the window, I don't need to hear about what kind of toothpaste you were using or how you really needed to get a new toothbrush. No. Concentrate on the details that are vital to the telling of your story. Number 3, if you're going to use dialogue, and I encourage you to do so, keep in mind David Sedaris' piece. Remember that direct dialogue between him and Santa, who kept asking him to sing? It was very effective. Make sure the dialogue you put in is crucial to the telling of your story. And last, use the right language and tone. If it's light and happy, don't give it too formal or ornate language, and vice versa. One thing that often comes up when we are telling our own story is this: do we tell the whole truth? And from whose point of view? Obviously, if I'm telling the story, it is from my point of view. However, my memory might not be 100% correct. A sibling, a parent, a friend might remember the story you are telling in a very different way. They might remember certain details that you have forgotten, and the same may be true the other way around. So be mindful of that. I'm not saying don't write a piece if it's the truth for you. Just remember that if you give it to someone who was also there for the event, they might challenge you on it. And remember, you do not have to share anything you write here with anyone you don't want to. You can, in your telling of a story, be upfront with the reader by including something like, "My grandfather probably won't agree with the details here," or "Someone in my family might challenge this, but this is how I remember it." And honestly, sometimes it really doesn't matter who is right. Not all the time, but some of the time anyway. There was a book that was published in 2003 called A Million Little Pieces by a man named James Frey. It's a harrowing memoir about the author's alcohol and drug addiction. It was hailed as brutally honest and so brave, until we found out he fabricated large portions of it. In fact, he got called out on the Oprah Winfrey Show. It turns out he had originally shopped it around to publishers as a novel and didn't sell it, so he reworked it as a memoir and then sold it that way. Lesson: make sure you are being as truthful as possible. You never know who is going to be fact-checking you. When we talk about character in creative nonfiction, it can be a little awkward because we ourselves, as well as family members, are all of a sudden main characters in our work. So things like personality, the way they look, the way they behave, their idiosyncrasies, the words they choose, all of these might be put down on paper. And when we think of ourselves as a character, it might be a new thought to us. One thing that might be hard, especially if you cast yourself as a central character, is to present yourself, warts and all. It's quite all right to present yourself with flaws. Heaven knows we all have them. It is even okay to exaggerate your flaws. It makes you, as a person, more engaging to the reader. So be honest about your flaws. They build character in your writing. Try to separate yourself from the piece by stepping back a little bit. Think of the piece as a slightly fictionalized version of yourself. So actually think of yourself as a character as you write. It will give you a little bit more freedom, too. Finally, recognize that roles change as stories progress. As we get older, our roles evolve. When you were really young, you might be the little sibling, the one who is protected by parents and older siblings. Later, you might be the one doing the protecting. Be aware that roles do shift, so that maybe looking back on an event in your life, you might be looking at it from a different perspective now. And that's totally fine. Just be aware of it. When it comes to setting, you don't have to give all of the details. You can use what is called broad strokes. This means, like in painting, using a big brush to cover more area. Use just a few details to add some interest. For instance, if I were to talk about the small high school I went to, I would say something like, it was an old brick school built in the 1930s. There were only 250 students across 4 grades, and we had no locks on our lockers. That would give you a suggestion, a flavor of what school was like without going on forever about how the floor plan was laid out. Also, give some thought to historical context. You know when this event happened because you were there. But for someone like me, who is much older than you, I might not have any context as to what the year might be or how old you were. Give your piece the flavor of the time when it happened. And give your piece a sense of place. Don't leave it floating in space. Ground it with a few details. When and where are we? What is it like there? How do you feel about it? For instance, I grew up in Minnesota, which is in the upper Midwest. The landscape is rather flat, and there is definitely cold and snow in the winter, and there is a feeling about the area that differs from Florida completely. People are probably more friendly. There is a thing called Minnesota nice, although one could argue that it's just Minnesota passive aggressive. But folks there are generally friendly. Since anyone from anywhere could be reading your piece, you need to help them with a few clues as to what life is like, as opposed to wherever your reader may be. Yeah, I grew up in Minnesota. Would someone from India or the Pacific Islands know what that means without a few details? You don't have to spend too much thought on it, but add at least a couple of details just to make sure. Finally, don't forget to engage the senses in your writing. We started this course talking about the 5 senses to insert images into your work. That doesn't just apply to poetry. This can be used across all types of creative writing. Images anchor us to the narrative. They ground us in the world you are trying to depict. Explore the sights, the sounds, the tastes, the feelings of the setting of your piece. You don't have to work in every single one every time. That would be overwhelming. Of course you don't. Just don't forget that these images help make your writing come alive for readers. So be selective, but make sure you have some of that in there. Also, and this might be a little counterintuitive, but just because something happened in a certain way doesn't mean you have to keep all the details exactly as they happened. You don't have to include every last detail to make something authentic. The reality is in the eye of the beholder to a large degree. You want the reader to have something to do. So it isn't necessary to include everything. Let the reader fill in some of the details too. At least the details that wouldn't matter in the main arc of the story. So, to get you started writing a memoir, I encourage you to make a few lists. Make a list for each topic here, and you will have a nice variety of things to choose from when you go to write your assignment for this week. Start with my first. That can be anything. Your first car, your first job, your first time swimming, your first speeding ticket. Make a list of all of these first things and some ideas that have meant something specific to you. Next, make a list of things you remember learning to do. Riding a bike, driving a car, reading. I remember the first chapter book I ever read all by myself. It was Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I still have that original copy that my dog Robbie chewed the corner of. Make a list of vacation memories that you took with your family or your friends. Where did you go? Did something amazing happen? I find amazing things often happen when we travel. Make a list of your favorite teachers. This doesn't have to be specifically related to school either. Was there someone who taught you something that you think is exceptional? My dad, for instance, has been one of my greatest teachers. Think about things you have discovered. Have you ever watched a butterfly emerge from a cocoon? Have you ever discovered something about a person that you didn't know before? Or even about yourself? Those are just what I had room for on this slide, but what about the things about who you are and your personality that are interesting? Think about Susan Cain's TED Talk on being an introvert and going off to camp with a big suitcase of books. Not everybody does that. Which, by the way, side note, is a fantastic concrete detail that she added to her narrative. Anyway, whichever topic you choose, I hope you have fun exploring this nonfiction creative genre. Thank you for watching, and see you back here next time for Module 8. Bye!